Hello, and welcome to the Bible Study Rewind for the Santee Church of Christ. Typically, we have our Bible studies on Sunday morning and Wednesday evening, and we started posting our class for Deuteronomy some time ago during this COVID thing, and so we're kind of continuing on with that. And instead of making a video of the entire class, I'm just condensing what we talked about in the class. So if anybody wants, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask in the comments, and we'll try to answer it the best we can. So if you want to know the overview of Deuteronomy, there is a video for that, and I'll put a link for that. There'll be a little card that'll come up, and you can check that out. But here we are in chapter 5, and Moses has already gone over a lot of their history and a lot of things about the things they need to think about. And here in chapter 5, of which we've already done 2 classes on this, I'm really blown away how much we spent diving into these commandments. These are the 10 commandments given to the people some 39.5 years prior to this time in Deuteronomy. And we have already covered the first 5 commandments. And those commandments are: you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any idols. That's the second one. You shall not take the name of Jehovah in vain, and observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those first 4 are essentially the relationship with God. And then after that, we start getting into the family. Honor your father and mother. That's the 5th commandment. That was the only commandment with the promise, which was, if you can do that, then you will live long in the land. Which we really got in quite a bit into that one. There's a lot to talk about on that one. So those are the 5 that we covered. And so last week, and those took 2 weeks to cover those, and it's just because there's so much in there. They seem very simple, but their implications go much further than just God telling people what to do. It really is God trying to lead his people to be more righteous, to be more like him, to understand his justice. And Moses has already told them, if you just exercise these laws, when you go into the land, everyone's going to see that and see you as being a wise people. And you can point to it that these are God's laws. So we're going to finish up the last 5 that we went over, and then I'm going to finish this chapter because we will finish it the next Sunday morning. It's going to take us 5 minutes, and we're going to finish it. And then we're going to get into the chapter 6, which is just a gigantic, I want to say it's kind of like another transition where God is explaining what he really wants, which is he wants his people to love him. Okay, so the next commandment is you shall not commit murder, or thou shalt not kill. And I had a note here about 1 John. Jesus equates hatred with murder. Jesus is pretty good about doing these things, and we're going to get into some of these things that are, are they figurative? Are they real? Are we sinning? That sort of thing. That word kill there, it means to dash in pieces. So this is that violent act of murdering somebody, of killing someone. And it's his first command when it comes to people interacting with other people. Don't kill them. Seems pretty simple, right? Well, we live in a different time, don't we? And these things still happen, of course. According to the word, its overall meaning, God is addressing unchecked anger and resulting physical rage like we saw with Cain. So we also talked a little bit about people in these days that might kill someone by accident. Even say you dug a pit and somebody fell in and died. Even though it was an accident, you were subject to penalties of vengeance by the family. If you were able to run and get to a city of refuge before the family exacted vengeance on you, you could stay in the city of refuge and nothing would hurt. They couldn't do anything to you. If you murdered somebody on purpose, that's a different thing. But if it was an accident, that's the sort of thing that covered. And then or you shall not commit adultery is the next command, which is kind of another, it really is a family-oriented sort of thing, command that wants, keeping the family together. And it's a very interesting law, because we're going to see a law that is very closely related to it. We already had the first family law, which was children, honor your father and mother. Now, parents, you do your part, and you stay married, and you don't go off and adulterate your marriage. And this is specifically speaking of sexual immorality. There are a few words in the Old Testament that denote fornication, including some religious practices. This command, however, deals directly with acts against a marriage vow. This specific word is not used until the law was dispensed in Exodus 20. Remember, this type of immorality became a form of worship within the idolatrous nations. It wasn't uncommon for men to go worship with prostitutes. I don't know how that worked, but that's just the way it worked. It was a form of worship, and this leads me to believe that this had become pervasive in the land, and God's telling them, you don't do that. And eventually, of course, it becomes an issue for them. And we also need to remember, marriage in those days was a deal between families, and women were mostly considered a commodity, like it or not. That's the way the tradition was. And she would bring a dowry to the marriage, and maybe the groom's family would send the other family a gift. But these were protections. That's my point. These were protections mostly for women and the women's family, because if a man dealt with a woman treacherously and just decided he didn't want to be with her anymore, that was an assault against the family. It was against the agreement and the vow, and that God can't stand that. I mean, we're told in the scriptures God hates divorce. He hates all of those things where it doesn't matter if it's a man doing it to the wife or if the wife's doing it to the husband. God doesn't like that sort of thing happening in families. Okay, so the next one, you shall not steal. Pretty simple. You don't thieve things. That's what that word means. You don't just take things that don't belong to you. It's really simple. And it's probably a prolific issue in that day, and not a lot has changed. It's still that way even today, because people just, for whatever reason, decide they're going to take something. These are all manifestations of issues with the heart. And this is what God's going after. We're going to see that in the next chapter. God's going after your heart. He's going after my heart. He's going after everybody's heart to capture it into this world of his, where there's justice and surety and all of these good things that he can bring. So the next one, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. We had a lot to talk about, and I'll go over the comments here in a second. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. The term means to witness with the intent to devastate someone or their name. It's another condition of the heart. You have this ill intent by somebody. There's a Hebrew word. This is a Hebrew word that means untruth. This context takes it a step further to actually destroy somebody. It isn't just lying. There is intent behind this lying. You're intending on hurting somebody. And later in chapter 19, in this case, in the courts, if you take somebody to court and you accuse them of something and you're lying, chapter 19 says, this behavior will receive a sentence. You will be punished without mercy. In other words, if you're caught lying, bearing false witness, you will be punished without mercy. You will receive the same punishment the accused would have received if found guilty. So God addresses that in chapter 19. And it's, again, this is an issue with the heart and the way people think. Sometimes people are really vicious this way. God's trying to address that because he doesn't want that going on with his people. Okay, and in the last one, and these are very short versions of these laws. Okay, I would suggest you read the whole thing, and you'll get a lot more out of it. But this the last of the 10 Commandments: you shall not lust after your neighbor's wife or covet anything which is your neighbor's. And there's a long list here. Don't covet his slaves or his animals or anything. And wow, it seems to the Christian, and these are really simple. Well, good. I'm glad you think that. I hope you would. We are really blessed to live in a time that it was 2,000 years ago that Jesus died, and we've been learning these things. And a lot of us haven't been learning them. A lot of us have been learning that morals are situational, and whatever you want to do is okay. And this shows that God doesn't think that at all. If you're looking to live that godly life that God is asking you to live, that's not it at all. He has very set boundaries on all of these things. So some of the comments that we had on those, like concerning stealing, was in today's society, we like to think there's different levels of stealing. There's, people steal because they're hungry, and they try to justify their stealing, and it just makes it worse when you do that. It just grows your sin. If you get into a habit, and this is what God was really getting after, was don't get into these habits. Don't get into the habit of stealing. There's all sorts of ways that we can do that. We can do it at work where we're not giving 100%. We can cheat on our taxes. There's so many things that can go wrong. It just because it's so easy, and that right at our disposal. And God is saying, don't do that. Be honest. Be straight. And that was some great discussion that we had during the class time. The other thing that we talked quite a bit about was the concept of false witnessing, not in the courts, but people just slandering your name, people who want to slander. And and one of the things that we did talk about was, if you're talking to somebody who likes to slander somebody, that's a red flag, because 9 times out of 10, we have to wonder, are they talking about me? But that's a serious business, and that includes something as simple or as deadly, I would say, as gossip, which gossip is one of the most poisonous things out there. It's bitterness and all sorts of things. And we also talked about avoiding repeating the gossip. And some of us were talking about how we defend, some of us will defend our gossiping by saying, I'm just speaking my mind. And all we want to do is slander somebody. We're not supposed to do that. God does not want us to do that. We are not under this law, but this concept never went away. It's still there, and it is there because it's a beautiful thing, because God's law is beautiful. We also talked about don't weaponize your opinion. And if you're listening to somebody speak ill about somebody and they don't want to cite their sources, or this is an anonymous person, we see that a lot today. Anonymous sources said this about this and this about this guy, and it's like, maybe we just need to tune that out and not even listen at all, because it's not worth it. It's not worth that whole negativity that whole thing brings. A little leaven leavens a whole lump. Somebody brought up, if you hear somebody bashing one of your brothers or sisters, or even anybody, that, you should, if they're gossiping, there's a few words, if you just say, should we be talking about this? And that would probably put an end to that discussion right there and then, because everyone knows what that means. Everyone knows that you're saying, this is gossip, and we need to not do that. The other thing that we talked quite a bit about was God laying down these laws about lusting after your neighbor's wife, obviously talking about a man lusting after somebody's stuff, his wife, his animals, his family, his land, whatever. Don't go there. This is an interesting concept, because God has already said, don't commit adultery. And now he's talking about the thought process that would lead a person to that. And it's kind of it just shows how important it was for people not to do these kinds of things. This one actually applies to the family as well. But it's a little bit broader, because now we're talking about your neighbors and your community and all the things that you can ruin if you let this sort of thinking, this sort of heart, because this is dealing with the heart. If you let this heart get away with and get the best of you, you can ruin your whole community with it. And it still happens today. People do these things and people start taking sides. Churches will take sides sometimes, and all of a sudden things just go up in smoke because people become selfish. All of these are dealing with the heart. All of these are dealing with God saying, I want you to be just with your families and with your communities. All these things started in mind, and Jesus. I did note this, that Jesus brings that out. One of our Bible students noted that it's a sin. Jesus stated basically. I kind of added to what he said, that Jesus does say that a man who lusts after a woman has already committed adultery in his heart. And we kind of left it open there that it's sinful in a sense, and maybe it is an outright sin. But I think we also have to consider the definition as it's presented by James, where James says, and I would suggest you look it up if you want to really look into it. He says that sin is when you act on your lust. And I'm just paraphrasing. So is lust sin? Well, as Jesus puts it, you might as well sin. You might as well have been doing the sin if you're entertaining the thought. And what he's talking about is what this is talking about. Don't entertain it so much. Don't let it become a part of your life. Because he goes on to say, oh, and by the way, instead of doing that, why don't you just tear out your eyeballs? Okay, right? Let's think about that. Does he want you to tear out your eyeballs? Well, no. He's showing the importance of not letting lust, not letting your thoughts rule you. You need to rein those things in. And that's what the Christian does. It doesn't mean that every time you think a sinful thought, that God's going to accuse you of sinning, what is your attitude toward that sin, towards those thoughts? That will go a lot further than anything else with God, because God knows your heart. If you think a sinful thought and you're apologetic about it and you're repentant about it, that's why Jesus hung on the cross. So there's that. I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole because we could actually spend an entire class on it, because there's a lot involved with that. If you're wondering about, if you're worried about my thoughts, sometimes I think sinful thoughts. Well, sometimes you probably do, because you're normal. But Paul explains the differences between when that's right and wrong to a certain extent. If you looked in Romans 7 and chapter 7 and chapter 8, he talks about the differences between the person who's just relying on the law and the person who's relying on Jesus and the Spirit. When you're living in the Spirit, you're moving toward a different direction. You're not moving towards those lustful thoughts. You're moving towards Jesus. I'm going to keep it there and just leave it at that. It's as simple as that. But if you really want to study it, note me in the comment section and we can maybe look at it. Okay, so that covers the 10 Commandments. That finishes them up. And the rest of the class is going to be on Monday. I'm just going to say this really quick. The response of the people, and was their response good, and what were they to do? Well, the people were terrified. When they got this at Mount Sinai, they were terrified because the mountain was full of thunder and lightning and things and smoke and all this stuff, and they were afraid. And they but they basically told Moses, look, you talk to God, and then you tell us what we're supposed to do, because they were just terrified of God. And God said, basically, he was pleased with that response. He was glad that they feared him, and they revered him enough that God said, would that this heart of theirs would be like this always. He hoped that they would always have this reverence for him, this proper understanding of who he is, that you don't take God for granted, and you don't act in an unjust way, which is God's main thing. That's who he is. He's just. So so what were they supposed to do? Well, they were to continue. God was to continue to speak to Moses, and this is what they did for another 38.5 years, or however long it was, 39 years, 38.5. The people would return at that time. God said, that's fine. That's fine that they're afraid of me. I'll just continue talking to you. Tell them to go back to their tents. And Moses would teach the people all those statutes. And so he's been doing this the whole time they've been wandering in the wilderness. And don't forget, Deuteronomy is the end of that wandering. And so they're supposed to incorporate them into their lives, do them without deviation. They are not to deviate one way or the other. They were not allowed to change them. So that's it. That sums up chapter 5. That brings us to the end of that. And next week we're going to break into chapter 6, which in my opinion has one of the most powerful and important passages in the entire Bible. Just my opinion. Mostly because Jesus is the one who points that out. So thank you. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at the Santee Church of Christ website. And if you have any questions or concerns, or if you want to learn anything, just let us know, and we'd be happy to help you. Thank you, and see you next week.